The house was never quiet in the way a house should be quiet. It was quiet the way a held breath is quiet. Not peaceful, not still, but suspended, waiting for something to break. The floorboards in the upstairs hallway had a particular creak, third board from the landing, and Nettie had learned to step around it the way she'd learned to step around most things in the 2 years since she'd become Mrs. Frederick Holt. Carefully, without making a sound. She was 24 years old, and she had already learned how to disappear inside her own home. The morning it ended, though she didn't know yet that it was ending. She was in the kitchen before anyone else had risen. That was her habit. Start the fire in the stove, set the water to boil, slice the bread, lay the table. She'd grown up watching her mother do the same in a house half this size, and her mother had done it with a kind of quiet efficiency that Nettie had tried to copy. There was dignity in it, her mother had said, in keeping a home, in making a place where people could come and feel held. Nettie had believed that once. She set the bread knife down and looked out the window over the yard. The elm tree at the back fence had begun to turn. September in Virginia meant the mornings were still warm, but the light had gone golden thin, and everything smelled faintly of something ending. She was standing at the window when she heard Frederick come in through the back door, early, which was unusual, and stop in the doorway behind her. She turned. He wasn't alone. 2 men came in behind him, both in riding clothes, both with the particular energy of men who had been drinking since before noon and found it funny. Nettie recognized the taller one, Mr. Cade, who owned the sawmill on the East Road. The other she'd seen once at a dinner party, though she couldn't place his name. Nettie, Frederick said. Not hello, not good morning. Just her name, like she was something he was identifying. I wasn't expecting guests, she said. We came for a drink. It's Cade's birthday. Frederick moved past her to the cabinet and opened it without asking. That was Frederick. He never asked for things in his own house, which was fine. But he'd stopped asking for things in her presence too, which was different, and she'd been slow to understand the difference. She began to move toward the door to give them the kitchen. That was the thing she did. She cleared herself out of rooms. Don't leave on our account, the one she didn't know said, and he had a kind of laugh underneath the words that made her pause. I'll leave you to it, she said, and she was almost through the door when she heard it. Frederick's voice, pitched for the room, not for her. She does that, disappears. It's her best quality, laughter. Both men. Frederick too. She stopped in the hallway. Her hand was on the doorframe, and she could feel the wood under her fingers, the particular grain of it, the small rough place near the top where a nail had once been. She stood there for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably 4 seconds. Then she went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. She had 8.60 in a tin under the floorboard beside the wardrobe. She'd been putting away small amounts for a year, without fully understanding why. A dime here, a quarter there, money from the household accounts that she managed with more precision than Frederick knew. It wasn't much. It was something. She thought about her mother's sister, Aunt Cora, who lived 50 miles east in Fredericksburg, in a house that smelled like dried lavender and old books, who had never married and had always said it was the best decision she'd ever made. Nettie had thought that was sad when she was younger. She didn't think so anymore. She sat on the edge of the bed and she listened to the laughter coming up through the floor and she thought, I have been disappearing for 2 years. I am very good at it now. What if I disappeared all the way? Her traveling bag was at the top of the wardrobe. She'd used it once, on the trip to Charlottesville for Frederick's cousin's wedding, where she'd sat beside him at the dinner table and smiled until her face hurt, and he'd told his cousin she was pleasant enough once you got used to her. She'd heard that too. She was always hearing things she wasn't supposed to hear, because she moved quietly and people forgot she was there. She pulled the bag down. She folded 2 dresses, her spare shoes, the wool shawl her mother had made her, the small Bible with her grandmother's handwriting in the margins. She took the tin from under the floorboard. She put on her better coat, the dark blue one, because it was the warmest she owned and because it had pockets. She left the wedding ring on the nightstand. She thought about leaving a note, and then she didn't, because she couldn't think of anything true to write that wouldn't also break her open, and she didn't want to be broken open in that house. She wanted to wait until she was somewhere else. Somewhere that had room for it. She went down the back stairs and out the kitchen door, and she didn't look back at the house. The road east was familiar to her for the first 4 miles, and then unfamiliar for the rest. She walked with her bag in one hand, and her coat buttoned high against the morning air. And she tried not to think about Frederick discovering her gone, about what his face would do, about whether he'd feel anything at all or simply be inconvenienced. She had a feeling it would be the latter, and she found, as the distance grew, that this was not as painful as she'd expected. It was its own kind of answer. She'd been walking about 2 hours when she heard the wagon. It came up behind her on the road, an older woman driving, a bay horse with a white streak down its face. The woman slowed without being asked. "You walking to Culpeper?" the woman said. "Fredericksburg," Nettie said. The woman looked at her bag, then at her face, then at the road ahead. "I'm going as far as the Millbrook Crossroads. That's 12 miles closer than where you're standing." "Thank you," Nettie said, and climbed up. The woman's name was Mrs. Drummond. She was 60 or so, with hands like a farmer's and a direct way of speaking that Nettie found immediately steadying. She didn't ask why Nettie was walking alone on a country road with a traveling bag. She talked about the drought that summer, about her daughter in Culpeper, who just had a baby, about the price of feed corn. Nettie sat beside her on the bench and let the words wash over her, and felt, for the first time in a long time, like she was allowed to take up space. "You got people in Fredericksburg?" Mrs. Drummond asked after a while. "My aunt," Nettie said. "Cora Prentice. She lives on Hanover Street. Good woman to have in your corner," Mrs. Drummond said, as if she knew her, and maybe she did. The world in this part of Virginia was not so large, and Nettie thought yes, that was the thing. She had forgotten she had people in her corner. She'd gotten so turned around inside that marriage that she'd forgotten there was a world outside it. People who had known her before, people who had liked what they knew. Mrs. Drummond left her at the crossroads with a wrapped piece of cornbread from her basket and directions that were more reliable than anything Nettie could have asked for. She walked the rest of the way. It took until late afternoon. Her feet hurt. She didn't stop. Aunt Cora came to the door before Nettie had finished knocking. She was a small woman, compact, with Nettie's mother's eyes and a way of taking in a situation, without speaking, that Nettie had always found either unsettling or comforting, depending on the situation. She looked at Nettie now, at the bag, the dusty hem, the look on her face, and stood back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." That was all. No exclamation, no questions, no performance of welcome. Just, "Come in," as if Nettie had been expected. Inside, the house was exactly as she remembered. Books on every surface. A narrow tabby cat asleep on the upholstered chair. Dried herbs in bunches hanging from the kitchen beam. Nettie sat at the kitchen table and put her bag down and felt the weight she'd been carrying lift about 2 inches off her shoulders. Not all the way, but some. Cora set tea in front of her and sat across the table. "Your mother doesn't know you're here," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, do you want her to?" "Not yet." Cora nodded. "How long have you been gone?" "Since this morning." Another nod. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "You're staying here, if I can." "You're staying here," Cora said again, and that settled it. The first week was the hardest and the easiest. Hardest because she woke every morning not knowing where she was for a moment, and then knowing, and feeling the whole shape of what she'd done settle down on her at once. She had walked out of her marriage with $8.60 and a traveling bag. She had no plan. She had an aunt who asked nothing of her, and a tabby cat who slept on her feet at night. That was what she had. Easiest because she slept through the night for the first time in a year. No waiting for the sound of Frederick on the stairs. No lying still so as not to disturb him. No checking her own and breathing to make sure it was acceptable. She slept long and deep and woke to the sound of Cora downstairs, to the smell of coffee, to light coming in through a window that was hers, to look out of for as long as she needed. Cora gave her a room that had been a sewing room, small and south-facing. It had a window that looked out over a garden that was going to seed for the fall. Tangled and a little wild and full of the particular beauty of things that had been allowed to grow without interference. Nettie sat at that window in the mornings and felt something she couldn't name at first. It took her 4 days to identify it as peace. She wrote to her mother on the 5th day. Not to explain, she couldn't explain it yet, didn't have the words for the accumulation of it, for the years of making herself smaller and smaller until she'd started to wonder if there was anything left. But to say she was safe, that she was with Cora, that she would write more when she could. She sealed the letter and gave it to Cora to post and sat with the particular vertigo of having done something that could not be undone. Cora came in that evening and put a glass of elderflower cordial on the table beside her. "He'll send someone," Nettie said. "He might. What do I do when he does?" Cora sat down. She was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what you want," she said. "Not what he wants. Not what your mother wants. What you want." Nettie thought about this. She thought about the ring on the nightstand, about the laughter coming up through the floor, about the way Frederick had said her name, Nettie, like he was identifying something. "I don't want to go back," she said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, and it sat between them with a kind of solid weight, not unkind, just real. Then you know what to do, Cora said. He sent his brother, not himself. She'd half expected that. His brother's name was Marcus, and he was younger than Frederick by 3 years, and had always been kinder. Not warm, exactly, but fair in the way Frederick had stopped being fair somewhere around the end of their first year of marriage. He came on a Wednesday morning, knocked at Cora's door, removed his hat when she answered. Nettie was in the garden. She heard his voice and came around the side of the house, and they looked at each other. Nettie, he said. Marcus, Frederick would like you to come home. I know, he says. Marcus paused. She watched him choose his words. He says whatever happened, it can be made right. She thought about saying what happened. She thought about describing to him the way she'd stood in that hallway with her hand on the doorframe and listened to his brother reduce her to a punchline. But it wasn't just that. That was the moment she'd understood, but the thing itself was 2 years long. You couldn't explain 2 years standing in a garden on a Wednesday morning. Nothing happened, she said. That's the thing. I left because nothing was happening. Nothing was ever going to happen. Marcus looked at her for a long time. He turned his hat in his hands. He was, she thought, a decent man in a difficult position, which was not the same as an ally but was also not nothing. He won't, he started. I know what he won't do, she said. I've known Frederick longer than you think. He looked at her in a way she couldn't read, and then he nodded once, and he went back down the path to the road. She watched him go, and her hands were steadier than she expected. She stayed. October came, and then November, and she stayed. Cora had a way of drawing women together without appearing to try. There was a neighbor, Mrs. Waverly, who came on Tuesday afternoons and always brought something from her kitchen. Apple butter, dried beans, once a rabbit she'd trapped herself. There was a younger woman, Sarah, who lived 2 streets over, and whom Nettie had trouble reading at first, until she understood that Sarah was guarded in the specific way that people who had been hurt in organized and systematic ways learned to be guarded. Over time, slowly, the guard came down. Nettie recognized the process because she was in the middle of it herself. They talked about practical things, mostly. The price of flour. The business of managing a loan. Sarah worked as a seamstress and had opinions about needles. Mrs. Waverly had a kitchen garden she'd built herself over 15 years that was, by any measure, a serious piece of work. Cora talked about books. Nettie listened and talked and listened more and understood, slowly, that this was what she'd been missing. Not community in the formal sense, not society, not the kind of group her mother belonged to where everyone wore their best and performed contentment at each other. But this, women who said what they thought. Women who had figured things out the hard way and were willing to say so. One afternoon in November, after Mrs. Waverly had gone and Sarah was putting on her coat, she paused in Cora's doorway. You sew? She said to Nettie. Reasonably well. I've got more work than I can manage. Through December, Christmas orders. I could use someone who's reasonably well if you want days. Nettie looked at her. I'd want that, she said. Yes, Sarah nodded. 7 in the morning. Bring your own thimble. It was not a dramatic offer. It was a job sewing Christmas orders in a woman's front room, for wages that would not make anyone rich. But Nettie walked back into Cora's kitchen and stood at the window over the garden, and felt something shift in her chest. A door swinging open somewhere in the architecture of herself that had been stuck for a long time. She had $8.60 when she'd left. In December she had $31.40, and a growing sense of what she was capable of when no one was asking her to be less than she was. The letter from Frederick came in January. She'd known it would come eventually, had been waiting for it in the specific way you wait for a thing you've decided to stop being afraid of, but which still arrives with its own particular weight. It was short. He said she had made her point. He said it was time for things to go back to normal. He said he had spoken to Reverend Caldwell, and he believed with some effort on both sides they could reach an understanding. Both sides. She read that twice. She put the letter on the table and looked at it for a while. Then she took a sheet of paper from Cora's writing desk and dipped the pen and wrote him back. It took her a long time. She wrote and crossed out and wrote again, and sat with the pen in her hand, looking at the garden through the window. Still deep in winter, everything stripped back to its bones. The beauty of it, entirely in what was still standing after the cold had taken everything else. She wrote, I am not returning. I want you to understand that this is not a point I am making, nor a position I intend to negotiate. I am telling you what is true. I was a good wife to you. I managed your household and your accounts and your social obligations, and I did all of it without complaint, and I received in return very little of what marriage is supposed to mean. I am not angry. I was, and now I'm not. and the not angry is harder to argue with. I wish you well. I hope you find someone who can give you what you... I am not that person, and I believe I knew it before we were married, and I believe you did, too. She didn't write about the laughter in the kitchen. She didn't need to. He would know what she meant. She sealed the letter and gave it to Cora, and didn't wait for a reply. Spring came the way it does in Virginia. Suddenly, all at once, as if winter had simply been holding its breath and then let go. The garden came back. Mrs. Waverly's kitchen garden was magnificent in March, and she brought Nettie out to show her the early greens coming up in the cold frames, and they stood in the thin warm light talking about seeds. And Nettie felt, very quietly, like someone who was learning a language she should have been taught years ago. She had been thinking about something since February. She'd been thinking about it, the way you think about something that is too large to look at directly. Sideways, out of the corner of your attention. Her grandmother, on her father's side, had left Nettie a small piece of land. Not much. 8 acres in Spotsylvania County. Largely wooded, inherited through a will that her father had described as eccentric, and her mother had described as impractical, and which Nettie had never thought much about because she'd had nowhere to put the thought. She'd been someone's wife. Wives lived in their husbands' houses on their husbands' land, and managed their husbands' accounts, and did not think about 8 acres of their own. She thought about it now. She wrote to the county recorder's office in Spotsylvania, and waited. She talked to Cora. Cora listened and then said, "You know a woman in Culpeper who settled her own claim through probate court last year. I can give you her name." The woman in Culpeper was named Mrs. Thayer, and she was formidable and practical, and met Nettie at her kitchen table on a Thursday in April, and walked her through every step of what she had done, and told her exactly which questions to ask and which office to go to, and gave her the name of a solicitor who, she said, was honest and did not charge more than he was worth. It took 4 months and cost more than Nettie had saved and less than she'd feared. In August, she held the deed. 8 acres. Wooded, mostly, with a small cleared corner where someone had once kept a kitchen garden. Quiet, the way a place that has been waiting is quiet, not suspended, not held, but resting, ready. She stood at the edge of the tree line on an afternoon in late August and looked at what she had and thought about what it might become. Not immediately, not all at once. But she had winter to plan in, and spring to begin in, and she was only now fully understanding this. She had time. She was 26 years old. She had time in a way she hadn't understood she had before, because she'd been so busy managing someone else's calendar that she'd forgotten to look at her own. Behind her, along the road, she could hear a wagon coming. Mrs. Drummond? Maybe. They had stayed in correspondence. A coincidence that was not quite a coincidence, because this part of Virginia turned out to be smaller than it seemed, and the women in it were better connected than men ever quite realized. Or perhaps Sarah, who had said she might come out Saturday to see the land, or no one. It didn't matter. She didn't have to know who it was before they arrived. She stood at the edge of her own land in the August light, and she put her hand on the bark of the nearest oak tree, and she felt it. Solid, real, older than her trouble, indifferent to all of it in the best possible way. She thought about the morning she'd stood in that hallway. Her hand on the doorframe. 4 seconds. Everything she was standing in had come from 4 seconds of not moving, followed by a choice to move. She turned toward the road. She was ready for whoever was coming.